A man saw his own funeral while he was missing. What happened next shocked everyone. Alexander Warren was at the top of the world. Over the past few years, he had built a tech empire that catapulted him to success, making him one of the most influential leaders in the industry. Warren Industries was his legacy, a company that started in the garage of his first home and now dominated the market with innovations ranging from artificial intelligence to cutting-edge communication technologies. The media idolized him, his peers admired him, and his face frequently appeared on the covers of business and tech magazines. Despite all this success, Alexander knew he hadn't done it alone. Two people stood beside him, forming the pillars of his life. The first was his wife, Emma, the woman who had been with him before his name was worth millions. Emma had always been his unwavering support, though in recent years, due to the company's expansion, their relationship had started to show signs of strain. Emma was strong and understanding, but Alexander knew he had let work consume much of his time, leaving their marriage in the background. The other pillar in Alexander's life was his best friend and business partner, David Blackwell. From the very beginning, David had been there side by side, helping build Warren Industries from the ground up. To Alexander, David wasn't just a business partner. He was the brother he never had, someone he trusted implicitly. Long hours working together, sharing the same dream, had bonded them in a way Alexander never thought possible. With David, he always felt safe, knowing that no matter what happened, he had a loyal person by his side. But lately, something had started to change. There were small details Alexander had noticed, but hadn't considered important in the whirlwind of work. David had become more distant, colder. The decisions they used to make together now seemed to come from David without prior discussion. In the past, they talked through every step the company took, but now, David appeared to run things as if it was solely his. Alexander attributed these changes to the company's growth, the stress of managing such a massive organization, but deep down, a small seed of doubt began to take root. Emma had also changed. Her energy, once full of light and optimism, had dimmed over the past few months. Alexander thought maybe they both needed a vacation, a break to reconnect after so many years of non-stop work. But whenever he suggested the idea, Emma would look at him with a tired smile and say it wasn't the right time. Though they still loved each other, an emotional distance was growing between them, something he couldn't fully understand yet. One Friday morning, after another long week of endless meetings and international calls, Alexander prepared for an important trip. He needed to close a deal in a remote region that would cement Warren Industries as the undisputed leader in the communications technology market. The trip would be short, just a couple of days, but it was crucial for the company's future. "Are you sure it's necessary for you to go?" Emma asked that morning, helping him pack. Her tone was a mix of concern and resignation. "Yes, it is. This deal is too important to leave in someone else's hands," Alexander replied, kissing her forehead. "I promise I'll be back in a few days, and after that, we'll take some time for ourselves." Emma looked at him with sad eyes but nodded, resigned. She knew that even though Alexander promised time together, something in him had changed. His priorities, as always, remained focused on work. Before leaving, Alexander went to his office to check some documents. David was there, waiting. As always, his partner appeared confident, but there was a coldness in his gaze that Alexander noticed but chose not to mention. "Take care of everything while I'm gone," Alexander told him. "You know I trust you." "I always do, Alex. There's nothing to worry about," David replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ignoring the warning signals in his gut, Alexander left David in charge and headed to the airport. The trip promised to be routine, a long flight, a meeting with potential partners, and a signature that would change the company's course. He was used to these types of trips, and though they were exhausting, he did them with the confidence that once the deal was done, everything would go back to normal. But fate had other plans. Alexander drove for hours down a desolate road, crossing a remote mountainous region far from civilization. The landscape, though beautiful, reminded him of how far he was from the world he knew. The silence of the road was deafening, but Alexander wasn't concerned. He was lost in thought, planning the company's next steps for expansion, when suddenly a car appeared behind him, speeding. At first, he thought it was just an impatient driver, but he quickly realized the car wasn't there by chance. The vehicle drew dangerously close to his side, and before he could react, a side collision knocked him off the road. His car spun out of control, flipping several times before crashing into a ditch. Everything went dark. Alexander's last thought before losing consciousness was a confused mix of images of Emma and David. What had gone wrong? His life, always so controlled, was now unraveling in chaos. And then silence enveloped him. Alexander awoke slowly, as if emerging from a deep, long sleep. Pain shot through every part of his body, from his limbs to his head. A distant murmur surrounded him, muffled voices and the constant sound of something he couldn't quite identify. His vision was blurred, and as he tried to move, a sharp stab in his side left him gasping. The air he breathed was tinged with humidity, mixed with the faint scent of disinfectant. There were no car noises, no city bustle. Instead, the atmosphere was quiet, almost desolate. When his eyes finally focused, the first thing he saw was a small, dusty window through which soft light filtered, barely illuminating the room he was in. The walls were bare, a faded white. "This isn't a hospital I've been to before," he thought as he tried to remember. But his thoughts were foggy. He didn't know how much time had passed since the accident. Accident. The word echoed in his mind, but the details were vague, confusing. He knew something had gone terribly wrong, something catastrophic, but his mind refused to give him the answers he needed. It felt as if he were trapped in a thick fog. The door creaked open softly, and a woman entered with a tray in her hands. She had a calm, almost soothing expression, though her eyes held a hint of concern. Lily Harper, according to the name embroidered on her nurse's uniform. She was tall, plain-looking, but kind, and her presence exuded a quiet calm that unsettled him. "I'm glad to see you're awake," Lily said, placing the tray on a table beside his bed. "You've been unconscious for several days." Alexander tried to speak, but his throat was dry, rough, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Only a whisper escaped his lips. Noticing his struggle, Lily handed him a glass of water, helping him lift his head just enough to drink. The cool liquid brought him slight relief. "Where am I?" he managed to ask, his voice weak and broken. "You're in a rural hospital," she calmly replied. "They found you after a car accident. The locals called an ambulance, and you were brought here. You didn't have any identification on you." The world slowly began to take shape again in Alexander's mind. The trip, the road, the car ramming him. He remembered the loss of control as his vehicle flipped, the confusion, the fear. But after that, everything was blank. "How long have I been here?" he asked, trying to piece together the fragments in his mind. Lily looked at him with a mixture of compassion and caution before answering, "Almost 2 weeks. We had to perform several surgeries to stabilize you. Your injuries were severe, but luckily the worst is over. However, it seems your memory has taken quite a hit. 2 weeks. 2 weeks missing with no one knowing where I was." That thought unsettled him deeply. If he had been gone for that long, what could have happened in his absence? Emma. David. He felt like something was terribly wrong, but his mind was still clouded with confusion. "We tried contacting someone, but without any ID," Lily continued, though her words seemed to drift through space without truly reaching Alexander, who was lost in his own thoughts. "Alexander. My name is Alexander Warren," he said, his voice raspy, the memories returning in flashes. I own a company. My wife. Emma." His voice trailed off. Lily paused for a moment, noticing the urgency and chaos in Alexander's eyes. She had cared for many patients over the years, but there was something about him that told her this man wasn't just anyone. Maybe it was his demeanor, even in such a vulnerable state, or the fragments he revealed about his life. A businessman, a man of power. That explained it all. The quality clothes he'd been found in, the luxury car wrecked in the accident. "Don't worry about that now," she said softly. "Your body still needs time to heal." But for Alexander, healing physically wasn't enough. Even though he didn't remember every detail of his life, something urgent gnawed at him. Something deeper than the wound in his side or the fractures that were just beginning to mend. He felt as if the world he had left behind was crumbling, and he couldn't stop it. The following days were a routine of care and rest. Although Alexander tried to regain his strength, his mind remained a puzzle he couldn't fully solve. Lily visited regularly, bringing medications and meals, but also engaging in small conversations. Over time, their exchanges became moments that helped Alexander reconnect with his past life. Without prying, she patiently listened as he spoke in fragmented sentences about his life. But the most frustrating part was that whenever he tried to dig deeper into certain memories, particularly about the accident, a sharp headache stopped him, as if his mind was blocking the answers he so desperately needed. One night, as a warm breeze entered through the small window, Alexander closed his eyes and tried to concentrate, forcing his mind to remember what had happened on that lonely road. The sounds, the lights, the impact. Slowly, small flashes of memory began to form. The fear, the car following him too closely, and the deliberate collision. It wasn't an accident. That revelation hit him like an undeniable truth. Someone had rammed him on purpose. But who? And why? The confusion and unease gnawed at him, but the only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't just sit there waiting. He needed answers, and most urgently, he had to return to his life. The days passed slowly in the rural hospital. Alexander tried to force his body to heal faster than it was capable, but his physical injuries still held him back. Though Lily cared for him with infinite patience, the frustration inside him grew with each passing moment, without answers. The truth that his accident wasn't accidental tormented him, but without a clear plan and with his mind still foggy, he didn't know where to start. One afternoon, as sunlight lazily streamed through the window of his room, Lily entered with a serious expression, different from her usual calm demeanor. In her hands was a crumpled newspaper, which she gently placed on the table beside Alexander's bed. There was something in her gaze that sent a chill down his spine. "What is it?" he asked, his tone alert. Lily took a deep breath before replying. "I heard something today that I think you need to know, and I think this confirms it." Without fully understanding what was happening, Alexander took the newspaper and unfolded it with trembling hands. What he saw on the front page made him freeze. The face staring back at him was his own. Beneath the photograph, in bold, shocking letters, the headline read, "Tech mogul Alexander Warren dies in a tragic car accident." The newspaper slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Time seemed to stop as the words of the headline echoed in his mind, over and over, like a relentless drumbeat. "I'm dead," Alexander whispered, incredulous, his voice barely a murmur. Lily, standing beside him, watched with a mix of compassion and concern. "That's what people believe, Alexander. They haven't found any other evidence after the accident, and without being able to identify you, they assumed the worst." A wave of emotions hit Alexander all at once: disbelief, anger, sadness, but above all, an overwhelming sense of urgency. If the world thought he was dead, what had happened to his life? What was happening in his absence? His company, Emma, David. With trembling hands, he bent down and picked up the newspaper. He looked at it more closely, as if by examining it further, reality might change. The article described the accident, noting that his car had been found flipped on a remote mountain road, with no signs of life inside. Local authorities had searched, But with no further leads, the news of his death had been confirmed. The paper mentioned that his funeral was being arranged in the city. "My funeral," he said in disbelief, looking up at Lily. "When is it?" "In 3 days. The city is preparing to say goodbye to you, Alexander." The news left him frozen. While he was alive, struggling to find answers, the world was moving on without him. His wife, his friends, his company, everything continued as if he no longer existed. The idea filled him with a sense of desperation, unlike anything he had ever felt before. "I have to go," he said with determination. "I need to see what's happening." Lily watched him, understanding the determination in his words. She knew he wasn't physically fit for a long journey yet, but she also knew that Alexander wouldn't stop. She couldn't prevent him from going to his own funeral, not when he so desperately needed answers. "If you're going, you can't do it alone," Lily said calmly. "You're not in a condition to travel without help. If you're truly going, I'll go with you." Alexander looked at her, surprised by her offer. Lily had no obligation to accompany him, but something about her, in her constant support, told him he could trust her. With few options, he accepted her help. The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Although still weak, Alexander mentally prepared himself for what he was about to witness. He had no idea what he would find when he arrived at his own funeral, but one thought haunted him deeply: David. Ever since he remembered that his accident had been no coincidence, part of him had begun to doubt his best friend. He knew David was handling the company in his absence, but to what end? The coldness he had noticed in the weeks leading up to his trip, the decisions David had made without consulting him, it all seemed to fit into a dark pattern that Alexander couldn't fully grasp. And then there was Emma. How was she coping with his loss? On the day of the funeral, Alexander and Lily set off for the city. The journey was silent, but charged with tension. As the car moved through increasingly familiar roads, Alexander's anxiety grew. His thoughts raced, trying to anticipate what he would find. Finally, they arrived at the cemetery, and Alexander stayed at a distance, hidden among the trees. From his vantage point, he could see the guests starting to gather. Family, friends, and business associates from his life were present. The coffin, adorned with flowers, rested in the center, and the solemnity of the moment sent a chill through him. But what truly shook him was what he saw next to the coffin. David, standing beside Emma, was comforting her as she cried inconsolably. His best friend, the man he had trusted like a brother, was there, by his wife's side, holding her hand. Their closeness didn't seem merely supportive. There was something in the way David looked at her, in the way he leaned in toward her, that sparked a deep and painful suspicion in Alexander's heart. As the ceremony continued, Alexander was forced to confront a devastating reality. David wasn't just taking over his company, but his personal life as well. Emma, consumed by grief, seemed to depend on David in a way that filled Alexander with a mix of betrayal, anguish, and rage. The wind softly rustled through the trees, but Alexander barely noticed. His body, still weak from his injuries, seemed numb to the cold creeping in with the evening. All he could do was watch. Watch as the world, his world, moved on without him. Just a few meters away, the scene of his own funeral unfolded, surreal and heartbreaking at the same time. Emma stood by the coffin, her face streaked with tears, while the priest spoke words that Alexander could barely hear. Everything felt distant, as if the world was distorted by an invisible barrier that kept him at a cruel distance. He was alive, yet dead to everyone present. He was a ghost in his own life. David, the man Alexander had considered a brother, stood beside Emma. The way he held Emma's hand, with a mixture of comfort and closeness that went beyond simple support, was impossible to ignore. Something had changed between them, and while Alexander couldn't pinpoint when everything had fallen apart, David's betrayal was as clear as day. "I can't believe it," Alexander murmured, barely aware that he was speaking out loud. Lily, standing beside him, watched with worried eyes. She had agreed to come with him, knowing this moment would be devastating, but hadn't imagined the depth of what Alexander would discover. As she watched the ceremony unfold, she realized that Alexander was facing a much deeper betrayal than even he had anticipated. "She looks so devastated," Lily whispered, more to herself than to Alexander. "It must have been so hard for her to lose you." Alexander clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to believe that it was all a misunderstanding, that David was just there to comfort Emma, as any good friend would. But there was something more in the way David looked at her. It was a look of possession, of someone who had taken what wasn't his. And Emma, lost in her grief, seemed to have accepted that closeness without realizing what was truly happening. The priest continued speaking, but Alexander couldn't focus on the words. His mind was a whirlwind of chaotic thoughts. David was there, not just taking his place in the company, but in his personal life as well. How long had it been since everything started falling apart? How long had David been planning this? The coffin before them seemed like a symbol of everything Alexander had lost. His life, his identity, his family. Everything he had built was being buried in that moment. And the worst part was that the man he had trusted most was leading it all. "I can't stay here," Alexander finally said, his voice low but full of tension. "I can't keep watching this." "I know," Lily replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But you need to stay calm. You can't confront them now, not without knowing more." Alexander nodded, knowing she was right, even though every instinct screamed at him to run toward them, to confront David and everyone present with the truth. But he wasn't ready, not physically, not emotionally. All he could do was watch from the shadows, trying to understand how his world had changed so much in such a short time. The ceremony continued, and one by one, the attendees approached to say their final goodbye to the coffin. Alexander felt a lump in his throat when Emma stepped forward, her body trembling as she placed a white rose on top of the coffin. Her sobs were uncontrollable, and seeing the woman he loved so broken tore him apart inside. He wanted to run to her, to tell her everything was okay, that he was alive, but something held him back. David stepped forward, wrapping his arm around her. Emma leaned into him, letting her body fall into his, seeking comfort. And there, in the midst of Emma's pain, David took the opportunity to step into a place that wasn't his to take. Alexander felt something break inside him at that moment. David hadn't just betrayed his trust. He had emotionally manipulated Emma in her most vulnerable state. Every second spent watching that scene confirmed what Alexander had feared since waking up in the rural hospital. His accident had been no accident. The betrayal was complete. The pieces started to fit together. David had waited for years to seize control of the company, and when Alexander began to notice changes in him before the accident, David had already begun plotting. The accident was the perfect opportunity to get rid of Alexander and take what he had coveted for so long. Not just his company, but his life, his place next to Emma. But how had things spiraled this far? Emma, his Emma, was now leaning on the man who had sought to destroy him. Seeing her crying in David's arms was more painful than any physical wound. Lily watched silently, understanding the agony Alexander was experiencing. She knew it wasn't the moment to speak. He needed to process what he was witnessing. But in her heart, she also understood that Alexander couldn't remain hidden for much longer. "Alexander," she said softly, "I know this is hard, but you need to think clearly. You need to know more before you act." Alexander nodded, his eyes still fixed on the funeral scene. He knew she was right. Even though everything in him wanted to scream the truth, he knew he couldn't return to his life without proof or a clear plan. David had played his cards well, and revealing he was alive too soon, without more information, could put him in an even worse situation. "Let's leave," he finally said, looking away from the funeral. "I can't stay here." Lily nodded and helped him quietly walk to the car. As they drove away from the cemetery, the weight of what he had witnessed pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He knew David was behind it all. He knew the man he had trusted blindly had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Back at the small rural hospital, Alexander couldn't find peace. The images of the funeral haunted him. David and Emma together, the apparent ease with which David had taken his place, and Emma's devastating grief, unaware that her husband was still alive. His own death had been orchestrated, and David was the key. He felt it in every fiber of his being. Sitting on his bed, watching the sunset through the window, Alexander knew he couldn't remain idle any longer. He needed answers. What he had witnessed couldn't be a coincidence, and his worst suspicions were beginning to take shape. David had been behind the accident. Lily, as always, entered the room with her usual calm, but this time the tension in Alexander was palpable. She sat next to him in silence, waiting for him to speak first, knowing the emotions he carried were too heavy to rush. "Lily, this wasn't an accident." The words finally came out, firm and filled with conviction. "David planned all of this. I knew something wasn't right before the trip, but I never saw it coming. He's taking my place. In everything." Lily nodded, understanding the weight of the revelation. "What will you do now?" she asked gently, knowing this couldn't be resolved impulsively. "I have to prove it," Alexander said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I can't just come back and announce I'm alive. David is smart. If he planned this, he will have covered his tracks. I need proof." Alexander knew he couldn't act alone. He needed someone he trusted completely, someone who could investigate from the inside. Then a name came to mind: Sarah. His sister, Sarah Warren, was sharp, always grounded, with an eye for details others missed. Although she hadn't been as involved in the company as Alexander or David, she had always been a constant presence in his life. Most importantly, Sarah would never betray him. If anyone could help him now, it was her. Lily watched in silence, seeing the plan take shape in Alexander's mind. She knew this wouldn't be an easy path, but she also knew he wouldn't stop until he got justice. He was determined to uncover the truth. "I'm going to contact my sister, Sarah," he said finally. "If anyone can help me investigate this from within, it's her. David won't suspect her." Lily nodded, approving of the plan. "That's a smart move. But be careful, Alexander. David seems closer to Emma than you imagined, and if he's capable of planning your death, he might be prepared for what comes next." Alexander knew Lily was right. David was clever, calculating, and had proven he could betray his best friend without remorse. What he had done wasn't just an attempt to take control of the company. It was also a grab for the life Alexander had built. That same night, with Lily's help, Alexander managed to send a message to his sister Sarah. He couldn't risk a direct call, not without knowing if David was monitoring the family's communications. The message was simple but effective. "Sarah, I need you. Everything they've told you about me is a lie. I can't explain now, but I need you to investigate. Talk to Jack Donovan and trust only him. What you find could save my life. I'll be back soon. Alexander." The message was sent discreetly, and now all he could do was wait. The following days were filled with tense waiting. Alexander felt trapped in limbo, unable to move freely, but also knowing time was running out. The longer it took to uncover the truth, the more power David would accumulate. However, he trusted Sarah. She was meticulous, and once involved, she wouldn't rest until she found the truth. Finally, word from Sarah arrived. Lily brought a discreet envelope one afternoon, making it clear it had come from Sarah. Alexander opened it with trembling hands, anxious to know what his sister had discovered. Inside was a brief report detailing the first irregularities Sarah had noticed in the company's finances. Suspicious money transfers had begun almost immediately after Alexander's accident. Large sums of money had been moved to accounts that weren't officially registered with the company. These transfers were linked to shell companies, all of which had hidden ties to David. The report confirmed what Alexander had feared. David hadn't just betrayed his trust, he had begun siphoning millions from the company. The movements were precise, carefully orchestrated to avoid immediate suspicion, but Sarah had found the cracks. "I knew he was behind this," Alexander said, his voice filled with restrained anger. "It's not enough to take my place beside Emma. He also wants everything I've built." But that wasn't all. Sarah had contacted Jack Donovan, a former detective whom Alexander trusted deeply. Jack had retired years ago, but his skills in investigating corporate fraud were legendary. According to Sarah's report, Jack had begun digging into Alexander's accident, and the first signs indicated manipulation in the accident records. The case had been closed far too quickly, and Alexander's car, which could have provided crucial evidence, had been destroyed shortly after the accident. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated cover-up. That night, Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. David had played with fire, and the worst part was that he did so with the certainty that he would never be caught. But now, Alexander had proof, or at least a trail to follow to dismantle the web of lies David had spun. "I can't stay in the shadows much longer, Lily," he said, looking at the woman who had been his constant support. "But it's still not time to act. I need to know more. Sarah and Jack are starting to uncover the pieces of the puzzle. When I have the full truth, that's when I'll return." While Alexander and Sarah began unraveling the threads of David's betrayal, Emma was living a completely different reality. For her, the world continued to turn in the darkness of mourning. Every day since Alexander's death was a constant battle against pain and loneliness. However, David, her closest friend and her late husband's business partner, had been her only steady support, the only refuge in her personal storm. Since Alexander had been declared dead, David had been there for her. David always knew the right words to say, the exact kind of support she needed during her most vulnerable moments. At first, Emma had felt guilty for relying on him so much, but David was patient, protective, and in her emotional fragility, Emma found comfort in his presence. The months following the funeral were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Emma still loved Alexander, but the grief was so overwhelming that she couldn't bear the thought of being completely alone. David knew this, and slowly he drew closer to her, invading her personal space, filling the voids left by her grief. With every gesture of comfort, David cemented his place in Emma's life. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Emma said one night as they had dinner together in her home, the same house she had once shared with Alexander. It was a casual dinner, something that would have been unthinkable before. But at that moment, it had become routine. "I'm here for you, Emma. I always will be," David replied with a warm smile, but his eyes revealed something deeper, more calculating. He knew he was gaining her trust, her affection, but more than that, he was ensuring that she depended entirely on him. Emma sensed something inside her had changed, but she didn't know how to explain it. Sometimes, when she looked at David, a small part of her felt uneasy, as if she were betraying Alexander's memory. But David was always there to calm her doubts, reminding her that everything he did was to help her. In her emotional fragility, Emma had come to rely on him for everything. However, deep down, something didn't feel right. A few days later, while sorting through some of Alexander's personal documents, Emma found an old wedding photo, a painful reminder of what she had lost. In the photo, Alexander and David stood together, laughing like the best friends they had always been. David had been part of her life for so long that Emma couldn't imagine him not being in it. But now, something was different. The closeness between them had changed, becoming more intense. Emma felt it, though she didn't know how to interpret it. The nights when David stayed late, talking and making her laugh when everything seemed too dark. The dinners they shared, the intimate conversations that she once only had with Alexander. David was filling the empty spaces, and while Emma appreciated it, she began to feel overwhelmed by how quickly everything had changed. An unsettling thought crossed her mind. Was she starting to depend on David in a way that wasn't natural? Maybe it's just the grief, she told herself to calm her doubts. But every time she found herself alone with David, that feeling grew stronger. It was as if something dark and deep was brewing beneath the surface, something Emma couldn't fully understand. Meanwhile, Alexander, still recovering in the rural hospital, battled his own feelings of betrayal. He knew Emma was being manipulated, but that didn't lessen the pain of seeing his wife grow closer to David. While he knew Emma wasn't to blame, she was lost in the grief of her loss. The emotional blow was undeniable. David is taking advantage of her vulnerability, he told Lily one night as they discussed their next steps. Lily had been his confidant, his support, and his silent observer throughout all this time. She had seen Alexander struggle with the emotional weight of what was happening. Emma doesn't know what's really happening, Lily responded gently. She's lost, just as you would be if you thought you'd lost the person you love. David knows that, and he's playing with that fragility. Alexander nodded, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. He knew he couldn't just return to his old life and pretend everything would go back to the way it was. Too much had changed. His relationship with Emma had been poisoned by David's lies and manipulations, and now he wasn't sure if he could repair that damage. The days passed, and David's influence continued to grow in Emma's life. Their conversations became more intimate, and what had started as a friendship in mourning now felt like something more. Emma found herself thinking about David more than she would have liked, and the guilt consumed her. She felt like she was betraying Alexander, even though he was no longer there. One night after dinner at Emma's house, David stayed later than usual. The conversation shifted to shared memories of Alexander, which seemed innocent enough. But David was crafting a subtle narrative, reminding Emma of how many decisions Alexander had made without consulting her, how he had immersed himself in his work to the point of neglecting her. "I've always admired you, Emma," David said, leaning toward her. "I never understood how Alexander could be so blind to what he had at home. You're incredible, and you deserve someone who truly sees you, not just as the wife of a mogul, but as the strong woman you are." Emma remained silent. David's words touched something inside her, something she had been trying to ignore for years. She felt the weight of those pent-up emotions, but didn't know if she should trust those feelings or if they were simply a reflection of her grief. Yet, in that moment, guilt and desire mingled, creating an emotional confusion in Emma that she couldn't ignore. Alexander walked slowly through the halls of the rural hospital, regaining his physical strength, but his mind was still consumed by the whirlwind of betrayal and suspicion. The days felt endless, and every moment spent away from his old life tormented him further. He knew he needed to return and face the reality, but he couldn't act without proof. Not when David controlled everything, from the company to Emma. Lily, as always, accompanied him on his walks, silently observing the inner turmoil he carried. She knew Alexander was doing everything he could to stay strong, but every day it became harder. What kept him going was the desire for justice and the need to reclaim his life. "How are you feeling today?" Lily asked, breaking the silence as they walked together through the hospital's garden. Alexander paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I'm better physically, but every time I think about what's happening, about what I saw at the funeral, I feel like a part of me is broken forever. I don't know how to regain everything I've lost." Lily nodded, understanding. She knew that the emotional damage ran far deeper than the physical, and while Alexander had healed enough to move around, his heart and mind were still trapped in the pain. But what worried her most was that he still didn't have all the answers. "But something's starting to come back, isn't it?" she asked, sensing that something inside Alexander was slowly awakening. He nodded, rubbing his temples as if trying to untangle a knot in his head. Fragments of memories had started to return, pieces of the day of the accident that had been completely blocked before. He knew the key to understanding everything lay in those memories, but every time he tried to dig deeper, the headaches became unbearable. What happened the day of the accident? I'm starting to remember more details, though not completely, Alexander said, his voice filled with frustration. I remember driving on the road and someone was following me. It was a dark car. I didn't see who was inside, but it was deliberate. They rammed me on purpose. Lily looked at him intently, realizing the gravity of what he was saying. This wasn't a random accident. It had been planned, executed with precision. Someone had wanted him off the road, and now, with the information Sarah and Jack were uncovering, the pieces were starting to fit together. I remember the impact. The car hit me hard, right at an angle that made me lose control. I flipped, and after that, everything went black, he said, rubbing his temples harder. Lily, in her usual calm manner, watched him. She knew that, while Alexander was starting to remember, the most important thing was that he didn't rush into action. He needed to remember everything before making a move. But what he already knew was enough to confirm his suspicions. David planned it all, Alexander finally said, as if the words burned his throat. He didn't just betray me in the company. He tried to kill me. Meanwhile, in the city, Sarah and Jack continued to dig deeper into their investigation. Jack, with his network of contacts, had managed to gather more information about the accident, and what he found was chilling. The police records had been tampered with. The evidence that could have proven the accident wasn't a coincidence had mysteriously disappeared. Jack discovered that Alexander's car had been destroyed shortly after the accident, with claims that it was too damaged to be examined. But there was more. The forensic reports on the car indicated that the brakes had been sabotaged, though that detail had never been included in the official report. Someone had paid to cover it up. It all points to David, Jack said, speaking to Sarah in his office. He knew he had to get Alexander out of the way. He took control of the company immediately after the accident, and now he's siphoning money through shell companies. This was all planned in advance. Sarah, frowning, looked at the evidence Jack had gathered. She knew her brother had been betrayed, but the magnitude of the betrayal was greater than she had imagined. David didn't just want the company. He wanted to destroy Alexander completely. "And Emma?" Sarah asked, her voice subdued. "Do you think she knows anything?" Jack shook his head. "I don't think so. David's manipulative, and he's been playing with her grief. He's using their closeness to maintain emotional control over her, but I doubt Emma knows what really happened to Alexander." Rage and sorrow filled Sarah. Emma was like a sister to her, and knowing that David was using Emma's pain for his own ends left her feeling both powerless and furious. Emma was being manipulated, just as Alexander had been betrayed. "We need to talk to Alexander," Sarah said, standing up. "He needs to know all of this." Back at the hospital, Alexander was still struggling with the fragments of his memories. The rage inside him grew as he realized the extent of David's betrayal. David hadn't just tried to kill him, he was now controlling his company and personal life. What Alexander had seen at the funeral was just the beginning. Lily noticed his agitation. "What will you do now, Alexander?" she asked, knowing the next step would be crucial. "I have to go back, but not yet. I need Sarah and Jack to finish gathering all the evidence. Only then can I act. David betrayed me, but I won't let him win. I won't just expose him. I'll destroy him. He must pay for what he's done, not just to me, but to Emma." Emma walked through the empty house she had once shared with Alexander, her footsteps echoing off the walls like a reminder of the memories they had left behind. Every room was filled with his presence, the photos, the furniture they had chosen together, the books Alexander had left on his desk before that fateful trip. But now it all seemed to belong to another life, a world where she no longer fit. The pain of his death still weighed heavily on her heart. But in the past few weeks, something else had begun to stir within her. David had been there from the start, helping her cope with the loss, being the only person she felt she could trust. At first, his closeness had been a comfort in the storm. But now, something had changed. Sitting in the chair where she used to curl up next to Alexander, Emma held a cup of tea in her hands, but her mind was elsewhere. David. She found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. The conversations they had shared over the past few months, the dinners, the intimate moments when he had comforted her, it was all starting to weigh on her conscience. What was really happening between them? Emma couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. The closeness she had allowed between them, the way she had leaned so much on David, was starting to feel like a betrayal of Alexander's memory. But there was another, more unsettling emotion that she couldn't ignore. Attraction. Emma felt it, though she tried to deny it. Guilt and desire mingled, creating an emotional confusion that left her trapped. "This isn't right," she muttered to herself, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to block out the images of the nights when David had stayed longer than he should have. That night, Emma and David had dinner together at the house that had once been her home with Alexander. The evening went as usual, casual conversation, the wine David always brought, and the growing familiarity between them. But that night, something was different. Emma felt a discomfort in her chest, a weight she couldn't quite identify. And then, as the words flowed, David began to talk about Alexander. "He was my best friend," David said, his voice softer than usual, as if he too was battling his own feelings. "But I always felt like he didn't appreciate you enough. He was always so immersed in his work, in the company. Sometimes I wondered if he really saw you, Emma." Emma felt a knot in her stomach. David had mentioned Alexander's devotion to his work before, but never in such an intimate, personal way. It was as if he was trying to plant a seed of doubt in her mind, something he had been doing subtly for weeks, but now it was more direct. "It wasn't like that, David," Emma responded, trying to defend her husband's memory, though she knew there was some truth in his words. "Alexander always loved me. It's just, sometimes he was too busy." David leaned in, gently placing his hand over hers. The closeness was palpable, and Emma immediately felt a wave of guilt. She knew she shouldn't let this continue, but she was so confused, so trapped in her grief, that she didn't know how to stop it. "I know he loved you, Emma, but I also know what you deserve, and I don't think he ever gave it to you fully." David looked her directly in the eyes, and in that moment, everything changed. Emma felt she was about to cross a line she could never undo. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, trapped between guilt and confusion. How had things reached this point? David had been the only one to hold her up through the darkest moments of her life, but now that closeness felt dangerous. She felt like she was betraying Alexander's memory, yet she couldn't deny what was happening. Suddenly, a disturbing thought crossed her mind. What if all of this isn't right? There was something in the way David talked about Alexander, in how he had so quickly become her pillar, that made her uncomfortable. There was something in his behavior that didn't quite fit. The next day, Emma decided to visit Warren Industries. It was something she had avoided since Alexander's death, partly because she couldn't bear to see how the business world had continued without him, and partly because she had trusted David to handle everything. However, she needed answers, though she wasn't exactly sure what she was looking for. When she arrived at the office, her first feeling was one of disorientation. Everything seemed to be running normally, but there was a strange emotional distance between her and the employees who had once been close. She knew grief had created a rift, but she also sensed something else had changed. The atmosphere was different. David was in his office talking to a couple of executives. When he saw her walk in, he quickly stood up, a smile on his face, but Emma noticed something strange in his eyes. It was as if he hadn't expected her to be there. "Emma, what a surprise," he said, walking toward her. "I didn't expect to see you today." "I just wanted to see how things were going," she replied, looking around. "I haven't been here since—" She didn't finish the sentence. It was too painful. David invited her into his office, and as they sat down, Emma couldn't help but notice documents on his desk. Financial movements, company papers. At first, she didn't think much of it, but then her mind began connecting the dots. She had heard rumors over the past few weeks about changes in the company, decisions David had made without consulting her. Was David taking more control than he was supposed to? Doubt began to grow in her mind, but before she could ask, David changed the subject, steering the conversation toward more personal matters. Once again, the way he talked about Alexander, as if he had never really been present in her life, as if he had been an obstacle rather than a partner, made her feel uneasy. That afternoon, Emma returned home with more questions than answers. David's closeness unsettled her, but there was also something else, something she couldn't quite identify. His decisions in the company, the way he seemed to be taking over everything as if Alexander had never existed. Something wasn't right. That night, after lying in bed for hours, Emma made a decision. She couldn't keep ignoring what she was feeling. She had to find out the truth. There was something more to all of this, something she couldn't see clearly yet, but it was beginning to take shape in her mind. David wasn't the man she thought she knew. Alexander couldn't wait much longer. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit, but he still needed the conclusive proof that would expose David's betrayal and the cover-up of his accident. The days spent in the rural hospital had made him stronger physically, but the emotional pain only continued to grow. He knew that David hadn't just stolen his company. He had also tried to take control of his life, manipulating Emma and consolidating his power. Meanwhile, in the city, Sarah and Jack Donovan were tirelessly working to uncover the final pieces of evidence they needed. Sarah had managed to gain access to critical financial documents, and Jack, through his contacts in the police, had found additional proof that Alexander's accident had been tampered with from the beginning. Now, all that remained was to bring everything together and prepare the final blow against David. On a grey, rainy morning, Sarah met with Jack in a small cafe, where they laid out all the documents they had gathered so far. They knew the next step would be crucial, exposing David in a way that wouldn't just ruin his career, but also destroy his reputation and bring him to justice. "Here's the key evidence," Jack said, sliding an envelope towards Sarah. "These documents show how money was siphoned from the company into offshore accounts. The shell companies David used were registered under front names, but all the transfers carry his hidden signature. He won't be able to deny it." Sarah opened the envelope, looking through the documents. It was more than she had expected. Transfers, altered financial records, all designed to benefit David while slowly sinking the company. Her brother had almost lost everything, but now the evidence was overwhelming. "And the accident?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, but filled with urgency. Jack nodded and handed her a second envelope. "The car records were manipulated just as we feared. The original forensic report, which was never given to authorities, shows that Alexander's car brakes were deliberately tampered with. Someone paid a lot of money to keep this buried." Sarah felt her stomach drop. It was one thing to suspect that David had orchestrated everything, but seeing the clear evidence in front of her brought a wave of disgust and fury. David had tried to kill her brother, and now he was controlling Emma's life while consolidating his power in the company. "This is enough to bring him down," Sarah said, her voice firm. "But we can't act yet. Alexander has to be the one to confront him." Jack nodded silently. They both knew that would be the hardest part. Alexander's return wouldn't just expose the betrayal, but would also unleash an emotional storm in everyone's lives, especially Emma's. Back at the rural hospital, Lily entered Alexander's room with a serious expression. Sarah had sent the evidence. Everything was ready. The weeks of waiting had been long and tense, but now Alexander had what he needed to confront David and take back his life. "Here's everything you need," Lily said, handing him an envelope full of documents. As Alexander opened it, his eyes fell on the evidence: the cover-up of the accident, the illegal money transfers, and the manipulation within the company. Alexander felt a mix of rage and relief. Everything he had suspected for weeks was right there, in black and white. David had betrayed him in the cruelest way possible. He hadn't just tried to destroy his professional life, he had also emotionally manipulated Emma, taking advantage of her grief. "What are you going to do now?" Lily asked, knowing that the answer would change the fate of everyone involved. "I'm going back," Alexander replied, his gaze fixed on the documents. "I'm going to expose David and take back what's mine." He knew it wouldn't be easy. Returning didn't just mean exposing David, it meant facing Emma. She had been manipulated, but the damage was already done. The pain of seeing how David had taken his place in her life was a burden Alexander couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, at Warren Industries, David was on the verge of completing the final step of his plan. The board meeting was set to take place in a few days, and David had planned to present a new proposal that would give him total control of the company. The board members fully trusted him, and after months of managing the company without the interference of Alexander, they were ready to grant him absolute power. What David didn't know was that his time was running out. The day of the meeting arrived. David was in his office, going over the documents he would present to the board. Everything was perfectly planned. The board members backed him, and no one suspected what had been happening behind the scenes. Everything he had dreamed of was about to be his. But just before the meeting began, Sarah entered his office without warning. David was surprised, but he kept his composure. He knew Sarah had been distant in recent weeks, but he thought it was simply due to the pain of losing her brother. "What are you doing here, Sarah?" David asked with a forced smile, though there was clear tension in his voice. Sarah stared at him, her eyes filled with barely contained fury. "I think it's time everyone knows the truth, David." David felt a chill run down his spine. The truth. For a moment, his mind raced for an escape, some way to manipulate the situation as he always did. But before he could react, the office doors swung open. Alexander walked into the room, moving with purpose, though his eyes reflected the pain of betrayal. David paled at the sight of him. "It can't be," David whispered, stepping back. "Yes, David, I'm alive," Alexander responded, his voice cold and controlled. "And I know everything you've done." The atmosphere in the Warren Industries boardroom was tense, charged with a silent uneasy that David hadn't anticipated. The board members were seated in their usual spots, waiting for the meeting to begin. David had been in control all this time, but the moment Alexander entered the room, all that confidence crumbled like a house of cards. The ghost had returned. Alexander walked to the front of the room, his gaze locked on David. Each step echoed through the room, a reminder that the man everyone believed to be dead was very much alive and ready to confront his betrayer. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to the real Alexander Warren," said Sarah, standing at the side of the room with Jack Donovan, who had been monitoring the process from the shadows. The board members were stunned. Murmurs filled the room with disbelief, and some even stood up to get a better look. David tried to react, but the words caught in his throat. His meticulously executed plan was now falling apart before his eyes. "This is impossible," David stammered, stepping back. "Alexander, you—" But he couldn't finish the sentence. Alexander, maintaining a tense calm, raised his hand and pointed at David. His eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "What you've done is unforgivable, David," Alexander said, his voice firm but restrained. "You betrayed me in the vilest way possible. You tried to kill me, you stole my company, and worst of all, you took advantage of the woman I love while she grieved my death." The silence in the room was absolute. The board members exchanged glances of confusion and horror. David, pale and sweating, struggled to regain his composure. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. What you're saying doesn't make sense, Alexander. I'm glad you're alive, but you're mistaken. Sarah stepped forward and threw a file onto the table. It was the complete dossier, the money transfers to the Shell accounts, the manipulated accident reports, and the financial documents showing how David had been siphoning funds since Alexander's disappearance. The evidence was irrefutable. "There's no misunderstanding, David," Sarah said sharply. "Here's all the proof of what you've done. The board has a right to see how you've deceived them for months." One of the board members, a serious, grey-haired man, picked up the documents and began to read. His eyes widened as he turned page after page, and when he finished, his gaze was filled with fury. "This is unacceptable," he exclaimed. David, have you been stealing from us?" David began to sweat even more. He tried to form a response, but every time he opened his mouth, nothing coherent came out. Alexander watched him with cold determination, knowing the confrontation had been inevitable, but also aware that this wouldn't end without an emotional reckoning. Emma wasn't present in the boardroom, but she had arrived at the office shortly before everything began. The secretary, nervous, had informed her that something important was happening and that Alexander was alive. The news hit her like a lightning bolt. Stunned and breathless, Emma hurried down the halls toward the boardroom. Alexander alive? How was that possible? How hadn't she known? Her thoughts raced, a mix of relief, confusion, and the guilt she had been carrying for weeks. When Emma reached the door of the boardroom, she paused for a moment. She could hear Alexander's voice from inside, but she was petrified. The man she had believed dead, the man she had loved with all her heart, was alive, but at that moment, all the complexity of her emotions surfaced. What would Alexander say when he found out what had happened with David? Emma opened the door with trembling hands, just as David was being confronted with the evidence. "David," said one of the board members, his voice firm, "this evidence is irrefutable. You've committed fraud, you've deceived this company, and if what Alexander says is true, you're also guilty of attempted murder." David desperately tried to maintain his composure, but his face betrayed the fear consuming him. "This is all a lie!" he finally shouted. "You can't blame me without a fair trial. This is a conspiracy. It's a setup." But no one in the room was listening. Alexander took another step toward David, his barely contained anger now beginning to surface. "David, you followed me that day," said Alexander, his voice trembling slightly, but with unshakable firmness. "You sabotaged my car and planned my death. You thought you'd never see me again, that you could take my place in everything, but you were wrong." At that moment, Emma entered the room. All eyes turned to her, but Alexander's gaze froze when he saw her. The surprise and pain on her face were unmistakable. Emma stood motionless, her eyes locked on Alexander. Love and guilt overwhelmed her all at once. Seeing him standing there, alive, when she had believed she would never see him again, flooded her with emotions. "Alexander," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Alexander looked deeply at her, seeing the confusion and pain in her face that mirrored his own. He knew that Emma had been manipulated, but he also knew that their relationship would never be the same. David, seeing Emma's entrance, clung desperately to his last chance. "Emma, this isn't what it looks like. Alexander, he's trying to destroy us. Everything I did was to protect you, to protect the company we built together," he said, reaching out to her. But Emma stepped back, distancing herself from him. For the first time, the truth began to become clear in her mind. David had manipulated every aspect of her life since Alexander's death. The attraction, the guilt, the comfort. It had all been a carefully orchestrated facade for David to take over, not just the company, but her personal life as well. Emma broke down in tears, her body trembling. Everything she had lived through in the past weeks was a lie. "David, what have you done?" she asked, her voice breaking. The silence in the boardroom was deafening after Emma's emotional collapse. David stood frozen, watching as everything crumbled in front of him. Emma, the woman he had manipulated and made believe that he was her only support, was now pulling away from him, completely shattered. Alexander kept his eyes on David, knowing this was the moment of truth, the moment when everything would come to light. He had waited weeks to get to this point, gathering evidence, enduring the pain of betrayal, and now, with his sister Sarah and Jack Donovan by his side, David was cornered. There was no escape. "Emma, please, you have to believe me," David pleaded, trying to move closer to her, but Emma stopped him with a gesture. "Don't come near me," Emma said, her voice broken but resolute. "All this time, I thought you were my friend, that you were helping me overcome losing Alexander. But it was all a lie, wasn't it?" Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, her words soaked in deep pain. "How could you do this to me?" David tried to justify his actions, but the words wouldn't come. He knew he had lost Emma forever, but he still clung desperately to the idea of saving his position in the company, of holding on to the little power he had left. "This is more complicated than you think, Emma," he said, his tone now colder, almost desperate. "I did what I had to do to save the company. Alexander was putting everything we built at risk." He tried to spin the narrative, searching for any justification for his betrayal. Alexander, however, didn't let him continue. "Stop lying, David," Alexander interrupted, his voice filled with authority. "Your ambition blinded you, and what you did was orchestrate my death to steal everything from me, not just my company, but also Emma." Emma sobbed quietly, feeling the weight of Alexander's words. David had played with her heart, her grief, while trying to destroy everything Alexander had built. The board members, who had been silent until now, began murmuring among themselves. The eldest director, who held the documents that Sarah and Jack had presented, stood up, his gaze fixed on David with disdain. "David," the older man said in a deep, authoritative voice, "all of this is unforgivable. We've reviewed the evidence, and your acts of embezzlement and fraud are clear. Not to mention the accusations of attempted murder are something we cannot ignore." He paused, looking at the rest of the board. "We will vote for your immediate dismissal and initiate legal proceedings against you." David, now completely desperate, tried to regain control, but every word he spoke only dug him deeper. He knew his downfall was inevitable. His plan, which had been so meticulous, was now unraveling completely. He had lost everything, the company, Emma, and any chance at redemption. "This can't end like this," David growled, his voice full of desperation. "I've done more for this company than anyone. I'm the one who kept it afloat while Alexander disappeared." "You're the one who tried to kill me, David," Alexander retorted, his voice cold as ice. "You pretended to be my friend, my brother, and used it to destroy me and take everything I loved. But now, you will face justice for your crimes." The weight of the truth fell on everyone in the room. There was nothing more to say. David had no more cards to play. Emma, trembling, moved away from the confrontation and headed toward the window in the boardroom. The pain in her chest was unbearable. Seeing Alexander there, alive, filled her with a mix of relief and anguish, but the guilt of what had happened with David suffocated her. Alexander watched her from a distance, his heart breaking at the sight of his wife's pain. He wanted to run to her, to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew their relationship had changed forever. David's betrayal had left deep scars, and though Emma wasn't to blame, the rift between them was undeniable. Emma finally spoke, not turning to face Alexander. I didn't know what was happening," she whispered. "I thought I had lost you forever, and David, manipulated me when I was at my most vulnerable." Her words broke off at the end, tears freely streaming down her face. Alexander took a step toward her but stopped. He knew what he said next would shape their future forever. "I don't blame you, Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I know David used you, but what happened between you two can't be undone." He paused, the pain on his face evident. "I love what we had, but I don't know if we can ever be what we were." Emma sobbed harder, understanding the truth in his words. Alexander's return couldn't erase what had happened. David's betrayal, though not her fault, had created a chasm between them that neither time nor apologies could fully heal. "Can we ever recover from this?" Emma asked, her voice trembling, though she already knew the answer. Alexander remained silent for a moment before shaking his head slightly. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "We'll have to find out together, but I know it won't be easy." As Emma and Alexander grappled with their pain, formal proceedings against David moved swiftly. Jack Donovan, with the help of his contacts, ensured all the evidence was presented to the authorities. David would be arrested within days, and with his reputation shattered and the truth exposed, his downfall was sealed. The company also began to recover. The board members, horrified by David's actions, quickly worked to restore Warren Industries under Alexander and Sarah, who would now lead the company. Days after David's fall, the lives of everyone involved started to take new shapes. The storm that had ravaged the world of Alexander, Emma, and Sarah was finally subsiding, but the emotional devastation it left behind was deep. Alexander's return had saved the company and revealed the truth, but the personal cost was immeasurable. David had been arrested the day after the board meeting. The evidence of his embezzlement, fraud, and attempted murder of Alexander was irrefutable. David Blackwell's fall was swift and brutal. The media pounced on the story of betrayal, creating headlines that condemned him publicly even before his trial. Everything he had built, everything he had stolen, crumbled within days. David was alone, abandoned by everyone who had once respected him, consumed by his own ambition. For Alexander, seeing his former friend and partner face the consequences didn't bring the peace he had hoped for. Justice had been served, but the emptiness inside him remained painful. The damage was already done, and he knew the emotional wounds would take much longer to heal. Emma, meanwhile, struggled to find a new balance in her life. She had been trapped in a nightmare, manipulated by David, and now, with the truth revealed, she felt more lost than ever. Her life with Alexander, the stability she had once known, now seemed like a distant dream. After David's downfall, Emma and Alexander tried to talk. They spent hours together, discussing what had happened, but each conversation ended in tears and uncomfortable silences. The love between them still existed, but it was tainted by the pain of betrayal and the emotional manipulation they had both endured. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden of the home they had shared for years, Emma finally stopped. The silence between them was heavy, full of unspoken words, and she finally decided to confront it. "Alexander," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't know how to move forward after all this." She paused, gazing out at the horizon. "I love you. I always have. But everything that's happened, I don't know if we can recover." Alexander, who had been holding those same words in his chest, nodded slowly. He knew she was right. The damage was too deep. It wasn't Emma's fault. He knew that. But he also understood that the trust between them had been shattered. "I don't know either," he admitted, his heart breaking. "We've been through too much, Emma. What David did destroyed us, both of us." Emma looked at him with tears in her eyes, but this time there was acceptance in them. Both of them knew that love, though strong, wasn't always enough to repair everything. "Maybe the best thing for both of us is to let go," Emma said, her words breaking her heart as she spoke them. "What we were doesn't exist anymore, and we can't pretend things will go back to how they were." Alexander said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. She had been his love, his life, but she was right. What they had shared had changed forever. "I will always love you," he said finally, his voice full of emotion. "But maybe it's time for us to find new ways to heal." They embraced, and in that moment, both understood that this was goodbye. Not a goodbye full of hatred or bitterness, but one filled with acceptance, with the understanding that some things cannot be repaired, no matter how much one tries. Lily had been watching from a distance, always discreet, always understanding. She had been the pillar Alexander needed during his darkest moments of recovery. Lily had helped him regain not only his physical strength, but also his determination. Throughout this entire process, her presence had been constant, offering him peace and support without asking for anything in return. That afternoon, after saying goodbye to Emma, Alexander found Lily in the garden, his face filled with melancholy, but also with deep gratitude. "I knew this day would come," Lily said softly, approaching him. "I knew that at some point you would have to close that chapter." Alexander looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, things began to make sense. Lily had always been there, from the moment she found him wounded and disoriented, until now, when he had faced his worst enemy and lost something important in the process. "I don't know how to thank you, Lily," Alexander said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Lily smiled, but her smile was more than just gratitude. It was a smile that showed she had been waiting for something too. She had seen Alexander at his lowest, and though she had never said it, she felt something more for him. Perhaps she hadn't recognized it before, but over time, her feelings had evolved. "You don't need to thank me," she replied calmly. "I just wanted to help you find your way back." She paused, her gaze soft but penetrating. "But I also want you to know something, Alexander. Being with you through all of this made me realize something. Maybe there's more I can offer you." Alexander looked at her, surprised by the sincerity and depth of her words. Lily had always been an unwavering support, but now he understood that what she offered was much more than comfort. It was an opportunity for something new, a new beginning. "I don't know what the future holds," Alexander said, taking her hand, "but if I'm here, with you, I think I can start to figure it out." He paused, and a faint smile appeared on his face. "I'd like to get to know you more, Lily. I'd like for us to give this a chance." Lily looked at him, both surprised and thrilled. The man she had cared for, the man she had helped heal, stood before her, not only as someone who had survived a tragedy, but as someone ready to move forward. "I want that too," she finally said, her voice soft but certain. "I don't know what's ahead, but I want to be there with you." Alexander embraced her gently, and in that gesture, they both knew that a new chapter was beginning for them, one filled with hope, possibilities, and a future that, though uncertain, now appeared brighter than ever. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of betrayal and redemption. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more heart-touching tales like this one. See you in the next one with more stories that touch the soul.